Hey guys, this is Justin at the Survivor Review, and today we'll be talking about episode 2 of HBO's Watchmen. Now, this was another really good episode. I really liked it. This episode simultaneously answered some questions while throwing more at you, so you're still like, what exactly is going on? You still don't quite know, but you're starting to get kind of a picture of things, starting to understand the world a little bit more, which I really liked. I also started to see like more of the parallels between this story and the Watchmen story, which I found really interesting. I saw a lot of kind of similarities between the original book and this show, and I'm starting to see, I think, where they're going with it, which is really interesting. So, like, this episode begins, again, kind of like how the first episode started, like, in a spot where you were not expecting a Watchmen story to start. The episode begins in Germany during World War I, and you see this German general-type character writing this letter that you see this plane flying over a bunch of soldiers, dropping the letter upon them, and you see it's like the black regime for the army, and the letter is basically talking to them, saying like, hey, like, why are you fighting for this country? Like, I know everyone's been telling you Germans are bad, but literally you're fighting for a country that doesn't like you and doesn't respect you at all, and you see, like, you know, white soldiers walking by and spitting on them and everything, and the person who grabs one of those letters is the guy from the opening of the last episode, the father of that kid in the opening of the first episode. And then, you know, it cuts to that kid trying on his dad's jacket and finding the letter inside and reading it. And then it fades into modern day, and you see Will, the elderly man in the wheelchair from the last episode, reading that letter, and you see, you know, the writing on the back that says, like, you must protect this boy, that you saw, like, in the first episode. So basically, that guy is the kid from those flashbacks. So that's interesting. That's a question answered right there, because I was watching those two flashbacks, like, how's this going to tie into the main story? What is that? And they tell you. So from then on, the episode picks up where the last one left off, and you see Angela picking up the guy, taking him back to her bakery to interrogate him and ask him, like, what's he doing there? And the guy's sitting there just like, oh yeah, I hung him. I hung Judd, you know, the police chief. And he's like, what? You can't do that. You're 90. You know, you're in a wheelchair. And he's just like, I'm 105, actually. And he keeps saying, like, oh yeah, I hung him. I put him up there. And, like, I like when she says, like, how did you do that? He's like, I did it with my mind. And she's like, no, you can't do that. And he's like, well, maybe I'm Dr. Manhattan. And she's like, no, he's on Mars, and he can't do that. That's not his superpower. And he's like, yeah, you're right. And Angela's not arresting him just because, like, she doesn't believe that he did it. She just believes that he's a senile old man, but she kind of figures that something is up with him. So, you know, she ends up getting his DNA off a coffee mug and takes that with her. So we'll get to that in a minute. After that, you get this one moment that I really like that feels straight out of the comics. One, you get to see the silhouette that was always outside Rorschach's apartment in the book. You see that very briefly in the alleyway when the car drives past it. And then you see this, like, scene of the newsstand. We see this, like, you see the owner of the newsstand. He's talking to the guy delivering the newspapers. And that felt, like, really out of the comics. You know, like the guy in the newsstand with the kid reading the Tales of the Black Freighter comic. So that kind of felt like a parallel to that. I thought that was a really interesting moment. I thought that was pretty cool. And the guy at the newspaper stand is discussing President Redford and the fact that he thinks that, like, all the baby squids falling from the sky are his faults. And then you even see a shot of newspaper that says, global squid falls baffle scientists. So I guess even they don't know what it is. So I'm really interested to see, like, what is that, and more information with that as the show progresses. And then you get to the scene of the rest of the cops discovering the dead body. And that seems really interesting. That's where I started to kind of notice things. Because I started to notice that the Tim Blake Nelson character kind of feels like our Rorschach character in a way. I mean, he's not really as extreme as Rorschach, but just like the visual parallel of him eating and just pulling the mask above his mouth, which is something that Rorschach would do. And you can also kind of tell that he seems like a little, like, far gone to where he's kind of just like, you can tell he's probably willing to do stuff that he probably shouldn't do to, like, get answers. So I kind of thought, like, he kind of looks like the Rorschach equivalent. And then, like, you get to the guy in the red suit who he's just pissed. He's ready to fuck shit up. Like, he's just angry at that. And then that leads them to go to Nixonville, which is kind of like this town of, like, homeless people and people living in RVs, where they know that a lot of people, part of the 7th Cavalry, live. And they basically have all the cops just standing outside, and the dude standing on top of the car with the microphone just yelling, like, come on out if you're part of the 7th Cavalry, because we know some of you aren't, but I don't care either way. If you don't come out, you know, soon we're gonna tear down your idol because there's this giant statue of Nixon up there. And then someone throws like a beer bottle at the car, and that's where he goes like, all right, that's it. And they just, cops and everyone just rush in and start beating everybody up. And Angela's kind of like, oh, I'm not sure this is the right thing to do. Now that scene, maybe I'm just looking too much into this, but that scene reminded me of the riot scene in Watchmen with Night Owl and Comedian when they're trying to stop all the rioters and calm them down, and, you know, Comedian standing outside the ship and everything, and then, like, you know, they start throwing stuff at him and he goes like, you know, that's it, and he jumps down into them, starts beating them up. Like, that scene felt like that. I'm not sure if that was just, you know, a coincidence or that was just supposed to be a reference, but it kind of felt like that. And I thought that was just a really interesting scene in general, just because it shows that, like, you know, not everything is perfect and everything's perfectly sane, because even, like, the cops are going a little far here, and even, like, Angela kind of gets that way too. There's one moment where one of the guys, like, rushes her and, like, she just pushes him to the ground, just starts beating the crap out of him, like, just crazy. So even she is going a little far in places, but I thought that was a really interesting scene. There's this good flashback sequence in the episode that I really liked. Basically, it flashes back to the nights where Angela's house got attacked, as she mentions in the last episode, and it's just a scene that I wasn't expecting, because the way it played out, like, it started so, like, nice, because it just flashes back, like, Christmas Eve, and her husband are kind of dancing by the Christmas tree, and he's waiting for the clock to hit midnight so he can open up his presents. And there's another thing with the clocks, especially, you know, the clock getting close to midnight. That's a big image in Watchmen. So seeing that here, I'm like, okay, I get that. And, you know, everything's all happy until all of a sudden they hear a noise, and he's just like, hey, you know, someone's in here. And then one of the 7th Cavalry people kicks in the door, and, like, she fights back. She ends up getting shot, like, straight in, like, the gut, which is pretty nuts. And then she wakes up in the hospital 3 days later, and Judd, the, you know, police chief, the Don Johnson character, is sitting there with her. So I like how, you know, we got Don Johnson back, even though he died in the last episode. So I feel like that's what his character's going to be like. We're going to see more of him in flashbacks as the show goes on. And that kind of makes me feel like Don Johnson is kind of like the comedian character of this show, because he dies in the first episode, and then he's kind of the catalyst for a lot of the plot, for especially for the cops going like heavily going after the 7th Cavalry, because now they have a reason to, because you know they killed him. They're trying to find out who did it exactly. So there's a parallel with the comedian's death and Rorschach investigating that. Now they're here investigating the captain's death, and then you even have the visual image in the last episode of the blood hitting the police badge, like the blood hitting the comedian's pin. And then also with Watchmen, you know, comedian dies early on in the story, but then he constantly appears throughout the story in flashbacks, and you get more of his character and more of what's going on with him. So in this one, you have Judd's character appearing in flashbacks, and so I'm assuming he's going to appear in more flashbacks, and there's going to be a bit more with him. I'm assuming they're hinting at a lot more stuff, especially like a closer relationship with him and Angela, I've kind of noticed. But that scene in the hospital with Judd and her is really interesting, because then you find out that, like, they briefly mentioned it in the last episode, the, like, incident, the White Knights. And you find out that that incident is that night, and basically it wasn't just Angela who got attacked, it was the entire police force. That the 7th Cavalry stages attack, like, at the perfect time on Christmas Eve night when everybody's, you know, nice asleep, and killed like half of the police force, and like the other half just kind of quit after that. They're like, nah, we ain't doing this. And the people that really stayed through it were Judd and Angela, so that's why they have such a close relationship, because they've stuck through this whole entire thing. And I just love the visuals in here and how they have like the parallel images, just like the comics did. Like how in this episode you have the shot of Judd grabbing Angela's hand, and it's a close-up of them holding hands, which cuts to the same exact, you know, position, except it's Angela holding Judd's dead body's hand as they zip him up in the body bag. And that's something that the comics did all the time, so that's a cool connection to that, and they're handling it very well. They're doing a very well, like, recreation of that kind of stuff, and really making it feel like the graphic novel. Then you have Angela taking the mug with Will's DNA on it to this museum where there's this exhibit all about the Tulsa massacre, and there's this computer system where you can put in, like, your DNA and get it tested to see, like, if you have any relation to, like, that act. Is either you were involved in it or you have family in it. And so she puts his DNA in there to find out information. The computer's just like, oh yeah, we'll call you back later when we have the results and everything. And another parallel with the comics is that I feel like this episode introduced their version of the Tales of the Black Freighter comics. You know, in the book, it kept cutting to the comic within the comic, and would sometimes have like that comic narrating over the actual story. Well, I feel like this show just introduced their version of that, and that is the American Hero TV special based upon the Minutemen that they kept teasing in the last episode. Like they kept showing ads for it. Because you see that it's premiering on TV, and it starts with this like crazy disclaimer, just being like no one ever under 17 should watch it, even with an adult, and it's gonna offend all this kind of stuff. It was pretty crazy. But then you're just thrown into it, and he starts off with this weird thing of like this dead body lying in like the water, and people digging it out, and just like this narration that almost kind of sounds like a Rorschach narration. And then it cuts to like the 1920s, and you see this grocery store being robbed, and then Hooded Justice pops in and saves the day. And then it cuts to like the rest of the story kind of continuing, but you still hear some of the narrations from American Hero playing over it. And you're like, okay, so I feel like this is something they're going to like cut back to as the show progresses, kind of like Tales of the Black Freighter, where it'll kind of occasionally cut back to that, and it's going to be something that kind of parallels the actual story going on. I just like how this is starting to feel like their own version of the Watchmen story. Like it's the same kind of thing and same idea, just kind of done a little bit differently, but with like different characters. Because then you have, later on, Angela goes to this kind of memorial type of party thing for Judd that's being held by his wife. And earlier in the episode, basically, Will was just like, some people have like secrets behind closets, like implying that there might be something more going on with Judd. And so she investigates that. She ends up going into his closet, puts on these goggles that look kind of similar to Night Owl's goggles, but they have like kind of an x-ray type of thing, and opens up this like hidden door behind some stuff in his closet and reveals a KKK uniform, which is just like, what? What is that? And then she immediately goes back to like her bakery where she's holding Will and just like throws the uniform at him, just like, did you do this? Did you plant this there? She doesn't believe it for a second. And he's just like, I can't. I'm in a wheelchair. I can't go upstairs, so I don't think I did it, you know? I don't know what's going on with Will. You find out like who he is, but they just add so many more questions to him. We see like when she walks in, he's unhooked himself from the handcuffs. He was actually able to go to the grocery store next door and pick up like eggs and everything. You're like, what is going on with this guy? And then she gets a phone call from the service that was doing the DNA test. And then, you know, she asks about, like, because the service is like, oh, is there any known relatives you'd like to know about or possible relatives? So she goes, yeah, and she says her name. And the service goes, oh, that is Will's granddaughter. So she's his granddaughter. How does that tie in with everything? I don't know, but that was interesting. I was not expecting that. So she just gets fed up with all this and just like goes, okay, I'm gonna arrest you. And she is taking him out to the car, puts him in her car, and then right as she's about to like get into the other door, this ship flies overhead, drops this like big magnet type of thing on the car, and flies off. And she just looks at it just like, what the hell? And the episode ends. What is going on with that? Who is this guy? Like, what is he? What's his importance? Like, what is... I'm just so curious about this character. Like I said, you got a little bit of information of who he is and his connection to Angela, but you still have hundreds more questions of who he is and what's he actually doing. So that's fascinating. And then one of the things I kind of going out of order with describing this episode, you have the little section with Adrian Veidt. And that section is still weird. It starts out the same way with him, like, having the cake, and you see him watching this play that they're acting out. You see the two, like, servant people in, like, lab coats, and you're, like, watching, and it's like, what is this going on? You have, like, him by himself, you have this one person off to the side with a mask over their face, like, doing the music, like, banging on drums and stuff, and we're like, and the guy's just like, you know, the lady's like, oh, do you have my watch? And he's like, oh, no, I left it in, like, the thing they were doing. I'm like, wait a second. And then you realize they're recreating the origin of Dr. Manhattan. For some reason, Adrian Veidt is putting on a play of Dr. Manhattan's origin. And you're like, what's going on? And like, then the guy gets into the machine that, like, you know, locks up, and he's like, oh no. And then all of a sudden, Veidt presses down this lever, and the guy just goes up in flames, like for real, and dies. And then Dr. Manhattan comes down from the ceiling, like, with the blue penis and everything, you know, perfectly recreating him, comes down, and the play ends. The guy playing Dr. Manhattan takes off the mask, and it's the same servant. And then you see all the other people involved in the play take off their masks, and they're just copies of either the female servant or the male servant. I knew there was something up with them. Like, I was thinking, like, maybe they weren't human or anything, but I think they're, like, like they're clones, but I still don't think they're human because they don't completely act normal. They don't act like they're aware of what's really going on. They seem kind of like alien or foreign type of thing. So there's some sort of clones. And I don't know what Veidt is doing. I don't know what he's doing because I don't know why he's doing a play of Dr. Manhattan or what's the point. Why does he have these like clones working for him? Like, I don't know, and I'm really curious. And I really like that scene. I thought it was super entertaining and just so weird watching this like super low rent recreation of the origin of Dr. Manhattan. And I just thought that was really interesting. Again, he goes over to the charred dead body and basically he says, put it with the rest. So there's must be a bunch of dead bodies somewhere in his castle, I guess, and picks up the watch, and the one servant's like, oh, like, did it stop working? And he goes like, nope, it's only just beginning. You see the clock hit midnight. And that's where his part in the episode ends. And you're like, okay, like, I'm still curious to see where that goes. Like I said, this episode, like, it answered a few little questions, which is a lot more than I thought it would. I just thought they would spend the episode, like, building stuff up. But they did answer a little bit, which felt satisfying, but then added more questions that just, like, make me really intrigued for what's going to happen next. Like, I really like this episode. I like the parallels with the comics. I like how the show seems to be doing its own kind of version of the Watchmen story, but just with new characters and kind of different themes, which I find very fascinating, and I really can't wait to see what happens next with the show. So yeah, that's episode 2 of HBO's Watchmen, and yeah, can't wait to see where it goes from here, and until next time, I'll talk to you guys later.